Hi, I'm Pastor Rob, Mount Pleasant Baptist Church. We're going to continue with our study of Holy Week. Today's Monday. The significant event of Monday was that Jesus cleared the temple. And we're going to be looking at Luke 19, verses 45 through 48. And then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in it, saying to them, "It is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." And he was teaching daily in the temple, but the chief priests, the scribes, the leaders of the people sought to destroy him and were unable to do anything, for all the people were very attentive to him. So if we really want to understand Jesus cleansing the temple, we really need to have an understanding of the temple. If you want to get a look at the architecture and the layout of the temple, you can Google Herod's temple. This would have been that temple, not the temple that Solomon built. And Google does show some very good examples of that. What we have on the board is not the actual physical layout of the church, but the temple. But we want to look at the significance of each of the areas of the temple. We'll begin with the Holy of Holies. This is where the Ark of the Covenant would have been kept. But by this time in the first century, the Ark had already disappeared into history. What gave the Ark of the Covenant its significance is on the inside, carried within it, would have been the stone tablets with the Ten Commandments on them. And on the lid was the mercy seat of God. And once a year on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies with lamb's blood and a hyssop and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat of God to cover the sins of the people for a year. This was a yearly occurrence. The Holy of Holies was partitioned off from the rest of the temple by a huge carpet. And this would be the carpet that was that went from the ceiling to floor, that would be ripped from top to bottom when Jesus dies on the cross on Friday. And the court of the priest is where the altar, the sacrifice altar, where you would do your sin sacrifices was. The menorah was there. All the items used in worship were there, and the priest would carry out their duties in the court of the priest. Then we come to the court of Israel. This is where the Hebrew men, the Jewish men, were allowed to congregate, followed by the court of the women, where they were allowed to congregate. And last was the court of the Gentiles, where they were allowed to congregate. This is a different layout than the original temple and the tabernacle, in that these three courts didn't exist. It was just one big congregation. By the time of Herod, they had already started to segregate people from one another. So if you were a Jewish man and the Holy of Holies represented where God was, this was as close to God as you were allowed to be. And then if you were by accident of birth, just simply born a woman, not based on anything that you had done or any of your behaviors, this was as close to God as you were allowed. And then if you were a Gentile, not born Jewish, this was as far as you were allowed to be. So they really were using the setup to kind of keep people away from God. And this really became apparent when we were talking about sinners. Jesus was always being chastised by the religious leaders for hanging out with sinners, for dining with prostitutes and tax collectors. And tax collectors were the most hated, not simply for what they did, but because they were handling graven images. And we'll get more into that with the money. I had a picture of Caesar, and that made it a graven image. And so they handled that, and that made them unclean. That made them sinners. And the Jewish establishment was so concerned about sin in the temple that if you were related to a tax collector by blood or marriage, you wouldn't have been allowed into the temple. So you were being kept from God, not for your own sins, but the sins of your relative. And that all comes to play a part because here in the court of the Gentiles, what that money with the graven image on it was exchanged for temple money, which had nothing basically on it. It was either just a sliver of silver. And the other thing that was set up there, if you didn't have your own lamb to sacrifice, this is where you bought your lamb. And this was all done at exorbitant prices, and they were basically profit off of religion. And the significance of this is the temple is where you went to deal with sin. That was the whole point of the Holy of Holies. The sacrifices was you dealing with sin. In the first century, there were, Bible scholars estimate there were over 700 synagogues in Jerusalem alone. And in the synagogue, you could pray, you could sing praises, you could study the Torah, but you could not deal with sin. The only place that sin was dealt with was in the temple. And so to clean it up, to make it a place where your sin could be dealt with, Jesus had to deal with the sin that was going on in the temple. So Jesus, in the other gospel, it really talks about how Jesus flipped over tables. In John, it talks about how Jesus made a whip. Jesus wasn't doing this simply out of rage or anger. He wasn't flipping tables because he was having a temper tantrum. It was a very deliberate act. It was an act of righteous indignation. He was saying to the people, to the Pharisees, that the temple is to be a house of prayer. This is where we come to meet with God. This is where we come where our sin is dealt with. And you're not letting the temple be used for its purpose. And so Jesus cleansed the temple. And as we go through this week, we'll see this was just the first. It continues on. Each day we get a little closer to the cross. The temple is destroyed again. We don't need the temple to deal with our sin. Jesus dealt with our sin. He was the blood sacrifice for our sin. He did that on the cross. And we'll continue to explore this as we go throughout the week. And I hope you will join us tomorrow. Thank you and have a good day.